The wind had a name in this part of the country. It wasn't a gentle name whispered by lovers, but a harsh, grating one spoken by farmers with cracked lips and sun-scorched brows. It was a wind that carried no relief, only the fine red dust of the plains and the scent of sun-baked earth. For 3 days, this wind had been Evelyn's only constant companion, whipping at the canvas cover of the carriage and working its way through the seams of her simple wool dress, leaving a gritty film on her skin. She sat straight-backed on the hard wooden bench, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were pale stones. She was 19. At 19, other girls in the small, damp town she'd left behind were thinking of dances, of ribbons for their hair, of stolen glances with boys who worked at the mercantile. Evelyn was thinking of the finality of the horizon. It stretched on forever, a relentless, unbroken line where a pale, washed-out sky met an ocean of brown, dying grass. This was her new home, a place without boundaries, yet she had never felt more like a prisoner. The arrangement, as her father had called it, had been made with the grim practicality of a livestock sale. There was no romance in it, only desperation, a failed crop, a debt that had grown like a cancer, and a long, unforgiving winter looming ahead had sealed her fate. Her father, a man whose hands had once been gentle but were now gnarled with worry and hard labor, hadn't been able to meet her eyes when he told her, "He's a good man. Evelyn," he'd mumbled, his gaze fixed on a loose floorboard. "A hard worker. He has land. You'll be provided for." "Provided for," the words echoed in the rhythmic creak of the carriage wheels. It was the same term used for a horse given a dry stall and a measure of oats. She was a debt settled, a mouth her family no longer had to feed. She understood the necessity of it. She had seen the fear in her mother's eyes, the way she would portion out the cornmeal as if it were gold dust. Love, in her world, was not about whispered promises. It was about survival. And her survival, it seemed, was to be bartered for the survival of her family. She had never been courted. She had never held a boy's hand or felt the warmth of a kind gaze meant only for her. The world of men was a world of gruff commands, of tired sighs, of the smell of sweat and soil. Tenderness was a luxury as foreign as silk sheets or porcelain dolls. Her heart was a still, quiet place, untouched by the flutters and fevers she'd heard other girls whisper about. It was a place she had learned to keep locked away. For what good was a soft heart in a hard world? All it did was get bruised. The driver, a taciturn man named Silas with a tobacco-stained beard, hadn't spoken more than a dozen words to her the entire journey. He had pointed out a distant smudge of trees once, saying, "Cottonwoods means water." But mostly, he just drove. The reins held loosely in his gloved hands, his presence as unremarkable as the dust devils that danced across the plains. "We're here," he said, his voice a low rumble. The carriage jolted to a stop. The sudden silence was more jarring than the constant noise had been. The only sound was the incessant wind, whistling a mournful tune around the corners of the carriage. Evelyn's heart, which had been a dull, steady drum of anxiety, began to beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She took a shallow breath, the air thick with heat and dust. She did not move. It felt as if moving would make it real. As long as she sat here, in the dim, stuffy confines of the carriage, she was still just a girl on a journey. The moment her foot touched that soil, she would be a wife. After a long moment, Silas cleared his throat. "He's coming." Slowly, forcing her rigid fingers to unclench. Evelyn leaned forward and pushed aside the canvas flap. The light was blinding, and she blinked, her eyes watering. Before her stood a small, sturdy cabin built of rough-hewn logs, chinked with mud and straw. It looked as though it had grown out of the earth itself, hunkered down low to brace against the wind. A thin curl of smoke rose from a stone chimney, the only sign of life. Beside it stood a barn, its wood weathered to a silver gray, and beyond that, nothing but the endless, undulating land, plowed into neat, dark furrows that stretched toward the horizon. And then she saw him. He wasn't standing on the porch to greet her. He was walking from the direction of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag tucked into his trousers. He moved with an unhurried, deliberate pace, his shoulders broad under a faded linen shirt. He was tall, but the vastness of the land seemed to diminish him. As he drew closer, she took in the details with the sharp, terrified clarity of a cornered animal. His name was Caleb. That was all she knew. Caleb Thorne. His face was not unkind, but it was a fortress. It was weathered and tanned by the sun, carved with lines of labor, not laughter. His jaw was firm, his mouth a straight, unsmiling line. His hair was the color of dark soil, long enough to brush the collar of his shirt, but it was his eyes that held her. They were a pale, clear blue, the color of the sky on a cold winter morning, and they seemed to absorb the light without reflecting any of it back. They looked at her not with welcome, nor with desire, but with a flat, assessing gaze. It was the look a man gives a field he must plow, or a tool he must mend. It was a look of practicality, devoid of all emotion. There was a strength in him, a solid, rooted quality, like an old oak that had withstood 100 storms. But there was no warmth. He was a man made of earth and stone and silence. Silas climbed down from his seat, his joints cracking in protest. "Got her here safe. Thorne, just as promised." Caleb stopped a few feet from the carriage, his gaze shifting from Evelyn to the driver. He gave a single, curt nod. He didn't speak. "She has a bag," Silas continued. Moving to the back of the carriage, he pulled down a small, worn canvas satchel, everything Evelyn owned in the world, and set it on the ground. It landed with a soft, pathetic thud. Caleb reached into his pocket and produced a few coins, dropping them into Silas's outstretched hand. The transaction was swift, silent, a wife delivered, payment rendered. Silas tipped his hat. "Good luck to you both." He climbed back onto his seat, gathered the reins, and with a click of his tongue and a snap of the leather, the carriage lurched forward. Evelyn watched it go, a cloud of red dust rising in its wake. It was her last link to everything she had ever known, and it was disappearing into the hazy distance. A profound and terrifying loneliness washed over her, so immense it threatened to drown her. She was an island in a sea of dust and silence. She was still sitting in the carriage, frozen, when Caleb finally spoke. His voice was deeper than she'd expected, a low baritone that seemed to vibrate in the dry air. "You can get out." It was not an invitation. It was a statement of fact. Her journey was over. This was her place now. Her limbs felt heavy, disconnected from her body. She moved stiffly, clumsily, gathering her skirts and swinging her legs over the side. Her worn leather boots sank into the soft, powdery dirt. She stood there, her small bag at her feet, a tiny, fragile figure dwarfed by the immense sky and the silent man before her. She kept her eyes fixed on the top button of his shirt, unable to meet that blank, blue gaze. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. She could hear the blood pounding in her ears. What was she supposed to do? What was she supposed to say? He seemed to feel no such awkwardness. He bent down, picked up her satchel in one large, calloused hand as if it weighed nothing, and turned toward the cabin. "Come on," he said over his shoulder. She followed him, her steps small and hesitant. It felt like walking to the gallows. There had been no wedding ceremony, no preacher to mumble words about love and honor. There had been no well wishes from friends, no tearful embrace from her mother. Her marriage was a quiet exchange of coin, a dusty plot of land, and a path to a stranger's door. She was afraid, a deep, cold fear that settled in the pit of her stomach. But beneath the fear was a layer of numb resignation. This was her life now, a life of silence, of service, of belonging to a man whose face showed her nothing, and whose heart she could not imagine ever knowing. The cabin door opened with a slight groan, and he stood aside to let her pass. Evelyn stepped over the threshold, her eyes taking a moment to adjust to the dim interior. The air inside was cool and smelled of wood smoke, pine, and something else, the clean, earthy scent of a place lived in by one person. It was a single room, larger than she expected, but starkly simple. To her right, a great stone hearth took up most of the wall, the embers of a fire glowing a soft, pulsating orange. A heavy iron pot hung from a hook over the coals, a thin wisp of steam curling from its lid. In the center of the room stood a table, solid and scarred with the marks of use, flanked by two straight-backed chairs. Against the far wall, there was a bed. Her eyes snagged on it, and her breath caught in her throat. It was not a large bed, but it seemed to dominate the small space. A simple frame of dark wood, a mattress stuffed with what she guessed was straw or corn husks, and a single, neatly folded quilt laid across it. This was the altar upon which her old life would be sacrificed. The thought came unbidden, sharp and cold. Caleb closed the door behind them, and the latch falling into place sounded like a prison gate locking. He set her satchel down by the door without a word and moved to the hearth. He took a wooden ladle, lifted the pot's lid, and stirred the contents. The savory smell of stew venison and root vegetables she guessed filled the room. It was a domestic, comforting smell that was completely at odds with the terror coiling in her belly. "There's food," he said, his back still to her. He gestured with the ladle toward the table. "Sit." She moved as if in a trance, her legs stiff. She pulled out one of the chairs and sat, folding her hands in her lap, her back ramrod straight. He ladled stew into two wooden bowls, placing one in front of her along with a spoon. He then took his own bowl and sat opposite her. They ate in a silence so profound that it seemed to have its own weight, pressing down on her shoulders. The only sounds were the soft crackle of the embers in the hearth and the scrape of their spoons against the bowls. Evelyn could feel his presence across the table, a solid, unmoving force. She didn't dare look at him, keeping her gaze fixed on the steam rising from her stew. She took small, mechanical bites, the food tasteless in her mouth. Her throat was so tight she could barely swallow. He ate with a slow, steady rhythm, his movements economical and efficient. He did not look at her either. He simply ate, his focus on his bowl. To him, this was just supper at the end of a long day. To her, it was the preamble to a nightmare. She thought of the whispers she had overheard at the market back home, older women talking with a mix of pity and coarse humor about the duties of a wife on her wedding night. Their words, which she had tried so hard to ignore, now came back to her, vivid and ugly. They spoke of it as an ordeal, a submission, a debt to be paid. When he finished, he pushed his empty bowl away and stood. He took both their bowls to a basin of water on a small stand near the door and washed them, his movements just as deliberate as when he ate. She watched his back, the muscles shifting under his shirt as he worked. He was a big man, strong. The realization sent a fresh wave of fear through her. After he was done, he picked up a lantern from the mantelpiece, struck a match, and lit the wick. A warm, flickering glow pushed back the encroaching shadows of dusk. "I have to see to the animals," he said, his voice even. He didn't look at her as he spoke. He walked to the door, took a heavy coat from a peg, and stepped outside, closing the door softly behind him. She was alone. For a long moment, she didn't move. She just sat at the table, listening to his footsteps fade as he walked toward the barn. Then, a shudder racked her body. She stood up on unsteady legs and began to pace the small space, her arms wrapped tightly around her waist. The cabin felt like a cage. She walked to the single window, its glass wavy and imperfect, and looked out. The sun had sunk below the horizon, leaving behind a sky bruised with purple and orange. The world outside was vast and empty. There was nowhere to run. Her gaze was drawn back to the bed. It waited for her, patient and menacing. This was her duty. This was the reason she was here. She was his wife. The thought was a bitter pill. She was not his beloved, not his partner. She was a piece of property, acquired to cook his meals, warm his bed, and, if God willed it, bear his children. With trembling fingers, she opened her small satchel and took out the only other dress she owned, a simple nightgown of plain, thin cotton, sewn by her own hands. Changing felt like a surrender. She turned her back to the door, as if he could see her through the solid wood, and quickly slipped out of her traveling dress and into the nightgown. The fabric was cool against her feverish skin. She didn't know how long she stood there, waiting. Time seemed to stretch and warp. The fire in the hearth burned down to glowing coals, and the cabin grew cooler. She was so tired, an exhaustion that went bone deep, but her mind was a whirlwind of fear and dread. She finally forced her legs to move, and she walked to the bed. She didn't get under the quilt. She simply sat on the edge, her bare feet cold against the wooden floor, and waited for her husband to return. When the door finally opened again, she flinched, her whole body tensing. Caleb stepped inside, bringing a gust of cold night air with him. He shut the door and hung his coat back on the peg. He didn't immediately look at her, instead moving to the hearth to add another log to the fire. The wood caught quickly, and fresh flames leaped up, casting dancing shadows across the room. He stood there for a moment, staring into the fire, his broad back a wall of silence. Then he turned. His eyes found her on the bed. She was a small, pale figure in the flickering light, her hands twisted together in her lap, her face a mask of disciplined terror. She braced herself, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. This was it. The moment had come. He looked at her for a long time. The silence was absolute. She could not read his expression in the shifting light. His face was a landscape of shadows. She saw his gaze travel from her face down to her clenched hands, and then to her bare feet on the cold floor. He didn't move closer. He just stood there, watching her, and for the first time, she felt he was truly seeing her not as a part of a transaction, not as a field to be plowed, but as a person, a terrified, 19-year-old person, a world away from everything she had ever known. Then he broke the silence, his voice low and rough. "The floor is cold. Get under the quilt." His words were so unexpected, so mundane, that she could only stare at him in confusion. Slowly, obediently, she shifted back and slipped her legs under the heavy quilt. It was coarse against her skin, but it was warm. She pulled it up to her chin, a flimsy shield. He watched her for another moment, then turned away. He walked not toward the bed, but toward a large wooden chest that stood against the wall. He lifted the heavy lid, the hinges groaning in protest, and pulled out a thick, dark wool blanket. He closed the chest, walked to the hearth, and spread the blanket on the floorboards in front of the fire. It was the furthest point in the room from the bed. Evelyn watched, her confusion mounting. What was he doing? He removed his boots, setting them neatly by the door. He unbuttoned his shirt, but only to pull it over his head, revealing a simple undershirt beneath. He was not undressing for her. He was preparing for sleep. He lay down on the blanket on the floor, his back to her, and pulled a section of it over his shoulder. He settled himself with the quiet sigh of a tired man at the end of a long day's work. And then there was only the sound of the fire and the wind outside. Evelyn lay perfectly still in the bed, her eyes wide in the darkness. She listened. She heard the soft crackle of the flames. She heard the low moan of the wind as it swept across the plains. And she heard the slow, steady sound of his breathing from the floor. He was not coming to the bed. He was not going to touch her. He was not going to claim his rights. The realization did not come in a sudden flash, but seeped into her slowly, like rain into parched earth. He had seen her fear. He had seen how she trembled, how she sat on the edge of that bed like a condemned prisoner. And he had chosen to give her this space, this peace, this unexpected, incomprehensible kindness. She had been prepared for roughness, for indifference, for a painful duty she must endure. She had not been prepared for gentleness. She did not know what to do with it. The kindness was so profound, so unlooked for, that it broke something open inside her. A single tear escaped and traced a hot path down her temple into her hair. Then another, and another. She turned her face into the pillow to muffle the sound, and for the first time in a very long time, Evelyn wept. She cried not from fear or from sorrow for her lost home. She cried for the simple, shocking decency of a man who owed her nothing but had given her a gift she hadn't even known she needed. In the vast, lonely darkness of the cabin, surrounded by a silence that was no longer threatening but peaceful, she cried herself into a deep and dreamless sleep. She woke to a sliver of pale gray light slanting through the cabin's single window. For a disoriented moment, she didn't know where she was. The scent of wood smoke and the unfamiliar weight of the quilt were the first clues. Then memory returned in a sudden, sharp flood: the carriage, the dusty farm, the silent man, her husband. Her eyes darted across the room. The space before the hearth was empty. The dark wool blanket was folded neatly and placed on the wooden chest. He was gone, lying alone in the bed. She felt a strange mix of relief and emptiness. The night before had been a trial of fear, but his unexpected gesture had left her feeling adrift, unmoored from the certainties of her dread. A faint sound from outside, the rhythmic clang of a hammer on metal, told her he was already at work in the barn, or perhaps a smithy she hadn't noticed. The sun was not yet fully risen, but his day had already begun. A sense of urgency pricked at her. She was a wife now. She had duties. She was here to earn her keep, and lying in bed while he worked was not part of the bargain. She slipped out from under the quilt, her bare feet meeting the cold shock of the floorboards. She dressed quickly in her only other garment, a simple, faded calico dress, her fingers fumbling with the buttons in her haste. The cabin, which had been a place of shadows and fear the night before, was now revealed in the morning light to be a space of stark, almost monastic, simplicity. Everything had its place. The tools by the hearth were clean, the floors were swept, the few pots and pans hanging from pegs were scrubbed bright. It was the home of a man who lived a life stripped down to its essentials. There were no frills, no comforts beyond what was necessary for survival. Her domain, she knew, was the hearth. It was the heart of any home, and now it was her responsibility. She approached it with trepidation. At home, she had always been her mother's helper, tasked with chopping vegetables or kneading dough that had already been mixed. She had never been solely in charge of a meal from start to finish. Staring at the cold ashes, she felt a wave of inadequacy wash over her. The days that followed fell into a pattern governed by the sun and the silence. They lived in the same small space, but their worlds barely touched. Caleb would be gone before she woke, and he would return at dusk, his face and clothes filmed with the red dust of the fields, his body moving with the slow weariness of a man who had spent all his strength under the sun. She would have a meal ready for him on the table. They would eat without speaking. After he had washed their bowls, he would sometimes sit by the fire for a spell, mending a piece of leather harness or sharpening a tool. The rasp of the file a lonely sound in the quiet room. Then, just as he had on the first night, he would take his blanket and sleep on the floor. He never offered a word of explanation, and she never dared to ask. Life for Evelyn became a series of new, painful lessons. The handle of the water bucket from the well was heavy and cold, raising angry red wheels on her palms. The axe for splitting kindling was unwieldy, and more than once the handle slipped in her grasp. jarring her arms to the shoulder. Her hands, which had known only the softness of thread and the prick of a sewing needle, were soon a geography of suffering. Blisters rose, broke, and bled, eventually hardening into calluses that felt foreign on her own skin. She was clumsy, and every task seemed to take twice as long as it should. Her greatest challenge, however, was the cooking. The provisions were simple flour, cornmeal, salted pork, potatoes, onions, and whatever he brought in from his hunting or trapping. But in her inexperienced hands, these simple ingredients often became disasters. Her first attempt at bread was a flat, dense brick that could have broken a tooth. The biscuits were scorched on the outside and doughy within. The stew was thin and watery one day, a salty sludge the next. Each evening, she would place the meal before him with a knot of dread in her stomach. She would watch him from under her lashes, waiting for the flicker of annoyance, the frown, the harsh word of criticism that she felt she deserved. It never came. Caleb would simply sit and eat. He ate the burnt biscuits, the leaden bread, the oversalted stew, and he never said a word. He would finish every last scrap on his plate, mopping up the last of the gravy with a piece of her failed bread. Then he would stand, take his bowl to the basin, and wash it. His silence was a mystery she could not solve. Was it a quiet form of cruelty, forcing her to stew in her own failure, or was it a kind of patience she couldn't comprehend? She didn't know which was worse. His blank, unreadable expression gave her nothing. She longed for a sign. Even a word of anger would be better than this vast, empty silence. At least anger was a feeling. This was nothing. It made her feel like a ghost in his home, her efforts unseen, her presence unacknowledged. One afternoon, more than a week after her arrival, she was determined to make something good, something that might prove she was not entirely useless. She was trying to fry slices of salted pork in a heavy iron skillet. The fire was too hot, and the grease splattered, spitting like angry demons. Flustered, distracted by a wisp of smoke that told her the cornbread in the bake kettle was starting to burn. She reached for the skillet and forgot the rag she usually used to protect her hand. Her fingers closed around the searing hot iron handle. A pain, white-hot and blinding, shot up her arm. She cried out, a sharp, involuntary gasp, and snatched her hand back, the skillet clattering dangerously on the hearthstones. Tears of shock and pain sprang to her eyes. She stared at her hand, at the angry red lines that were already beginning to blister across her palm and fingers. She cradled it to her chest, biting her lip to keep from crying out again. The cabin door swung open. Caleb stood there, framed in the doorway, a silhouette against the bright afternoon sun. He must have been on his way in from the fields. His face was in shadow, but she could feel his eyes on her. For a moment, he didn't move. She froze, her breath held tight in her chest, expecting him to be angry about the noise, about her foolishness. Then he moved. He didn't speak. He closed the door, walked past her, and went directly to the water pump by the basin. He worked the handle, and cool, clear water gushed into the basin. He looked at her and gave a small, sharp jerk of his head, indicating she should come. Her feet felt rooted to the floor. "It's nothing," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I was just careless." He ignored her words. He walked back to her, and before she could protest, he took her by the elbow. His grip was firm, but not rough. He led her to the basin and, taking her injured hand in his, gently submerged it in the cool water. The relief was immediate and so intense it made her feel weak. She let out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she was holding. He held her hand under the water, his large, calloused fingers cradling hers with an impossible gentleness. His hands were a farmer's hands, stained with earth and scored with scars, but his touch was as careful as a doctor's. He kept her hand in the water for a long time, the silence broken only by the hiss of the fire and the drip of water from the pump. She stared at their joined hands, his large and brown against her pale, trembling one. It was the most intimate contact they had ever shared. More intimate than sharing a room. More intimate than the title of husband and wife that bound them. When he finally drew her hand from the water, he examined the burn with a focused, serious expression. The skin was red and puffy, and small blisters were already forming. He turned, opened the wooden chest, and rummaged inside, producing a roll of clean linen and a small tin of salve that smelled faintly of pine and herbs. Still without a word, he gently dried her hand with a corner of the linen. He opened the tin, scooped out a bit of the cool, greasy salve with one finger, and began to smooth it over the burn. His touch was feather-light. He worked with a quiet concentration, his brow furrowed slightly. He took the linen and, tearing a strip from it, began to wrap her hand, his movements deft and sure. He tied the bandage with a neat, practical knot. The entire time, he did not speak. He did not say, "You should be more careful." He did not say, "Does it hurt?" He simply tended to the wound. When he was finished, he released her hand. She stared at the neat white bandage, a stark contrast to her work-stained dress. She lifted her eyes to his face, but he was already turning away, moving to the hearth to rescue the skillet and the now smoking cornbread. He acted as if nothing had happened. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He paused, his back to her, and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Then he continued with his task. She stood by the water basin, her uninjured hand pressed to her chest, her heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm. The pain in her bandaged hand was a dull throb, but it was overshadowed by a new, bewildering sensation. He hadn't admonished her. He hadn't ignored her. He had cared for her. It was a simple, practical act, born of necessity. But the gentleness of his hands had spoken more than words ever could. In the vast, lonely silence of their life together, this small, quiet act of tenderness was as loud as a shout. It was a single drop of rain on a parched and barren landscape, and she did not know if it was a promise of more to come, or just a fleeting anomaly that would soon be swallowed by the dust. The bandage on her hand was a constant reminder. In the silent, lonely days that followed the accident, Evelyn found herself glancing at it often. It was a small patch of white in a world of brown dust and gray wood, a symbol of a moment that had briefly, almost imperceptibly, altered the landscape of her new life. Caleb had not mentioned it again. He had simply left the tin of salve on the mantelpiece, and she had taken it upon herself to clean the burn and redress it each morning. But something had shifted between them. The silence was still there, a vast and unchanging ocean, but now a current of awareness ran beneath it. She found herself watching him more, noticing the small things, the way he favored his left shoulder when he was tired, the deep lines that fanned from the corners of his eyes when he stared out at the horizon, the quiet efficiency of his hands, whether he was repairing a fence post or cleaning his rifle. He was a man who lived by rhythms, the ancient rhythms of the sun and the seasons. His life was a testament to hard work and solitude. She began to understand that his silence wasn't a rejection of her, but a part of his nature, ingrained in him by the vast, quiet land he worked. The land didn't ask for conversation. It demanded sweat and vigilance, and Caleb gave it what it demanded. Her cooking slowly improved. The bread began to rise. The stews thickened properly, and the biscuits were more often golden than black. He still ate without comment, but she no longer saw his silence as a judgment. Instead, she began to see his clean plate as a quiet, unspoken form of acknowledgement. It was enough. One afternoon, the wind died down, and a heavy, oppressive heat settled over the plains. The air in the cabin was thick and still. It was a good day for a task she had been putting off, scrubbing the floorboards. The floor was packed earth in the small kitchen area by the hearth, but in the main living space, it was made of wide wooden planks, worn smooth by years of use but stained with the dirt of daily life. She fetched a bucket of water from the well, adding a scoop of harsh lye soap that made the water feel slick and dangerous. On her hands and knees, with a stiff bristled brush. She began to work. It was hard, punishing labor. The rough wood scraped at her knees through her thin dress, and the lye stung the healing skin on her hand. But there was a satisfaction in it, too. With each scrubbed plank, she felt she was erasing a little of the grime, imposing a small pocket of order on this wild, untamed place. She was making a mark, however small, on her new home. She worked her way backward from the far wall, her head down, lost in the repetitive motion of the task. The damp, clean scent of wet pine and soap filled the air. Her sleeves were rolled up high on her arms to keep them dry, and a stray strand of hair had escaped its bun, sticking to her damp forehead. She was so focused on her work that she didn't hear the cabin door open. "Need more water?" Caleb's voice, so rarely heard inside these walls during the daylight hours, startled her. She gasped, her head jerking up. He was standing just inside the doorway, a bucket in each hand, his shirt dark with sweat. He must have come back from the well. "No, I have enough," she stammered, feeling a flush of embarrassment at being caught in such a state, on her knees, disheveled and dirty. He gave a slight nod and set the fresh buckets down near the door. He didn't leave. He stood there for a moment, his gaze sweeping over the room. She remained on the floor, frozen in a half-crouch, the wet brush still in her hand. It was then that his eyes settled on her arm, the one she was using to brace herself against the floor. Her sleeve had ridden up past her elbow, and there, on the pale, delicate skin of her inner wrist, was a bruise. It was old, a sickly, faded stain of yellow and faint purple, the ghost of a hurt that had happened long before she ever set foot on this farm. It was the mark of fingers that had gripped her too tightly, a small, ugly map of a moment of pain. She saw him notice it, his eyes, usually so distant, sharpened with a sudden, focused intensity. His body went still. Instinctively, shamefully, she snatched her hand back and quickly pulled her sleeve down, hiding the mark from his sight. The gesture was frantic, guilty, as if she had been caught with something stolen. The silence in the room became taut, charged. He took a slow step toward her. She flinched, pressing herself back on her heels, her heart beginning to pound a familiar, frantic rhythm of fear. He stopped, seeing her reaction. He didn't come any closer. When he spoke, his voice was unnervingly quiet, stripped of its usual gruffness. It was a gentle rumble, softer than she had ever heard it. "Who did that?" The question hung in the hot, still air between them. It was a simple question, but it was aimed at a place deep inside her that she kept locked and buried, a place of shadows and fear. She couldn't answer. The words wouldn't come. To speak of it would be to give it life again, to drag the ugliness of the past into the fragile peace of the present. Her father, in a fit of drink-fueled anger over a broken tool, a hired hand whose advances she had spurned. The memories were a tangled, thorny thicket in her mind. To speak of one would be to speak of them all, of a life where a man's hand was more often a source of pain than comfort. She lowered her head, her gaze fixed on a dark knot in the floorboards. She shook her head, a small, tight gesture of negation. It was not a denial that it had happened, but a desperate plea not to have to speak of it. She couldn't look at him, but she could feel his eyes on her, feel the weight of his waiting. She risked a glance up at him through her lashes, and in that fleeting moment, her eyes told him everything her voice could not. In them, he saw the shadow of an old terror, the learned fear of a creature that has been taught to expect a blow. He saw the reason she had sat so stiffly on the edge of the bed on their first night, the reason she sometimes flinched if he moved too suddenly. He saw it all. A muscle tightened in his jaw. For a long, tense moment, he stood there, a towering, silent figure. She thought he would press her, demand an answer. It was his right, wasn't it? She was his wife. Her past, her present, her future, it all belonged to him now. But he did not ask again. He seemed to let out a breath she hadn't realized he was holding. The tension in his shoulders eased. He looked away from her, his gaze falling on the cabin door. He walked over to it, his heavy boots making a hollow sound on the clean planks. He swung the door back and forth a few times, his attention now fixed on a slightly loose iron hinge. He turned, walked to the small tool chest by the hearth, and took out a hammer and a small block of wood. Without another glance in her direction, he set to work, tapping the hinge gently back into place. The sharp, rhythmic sound of the hammer striking the wood block filled the silence. Evelyn remained on the floor, watching him. He was not angry. He was not disgusted. He had looked into the darkest corner of her past, and instead of recoiling or demanding an explanation, he had simply accepted it. He had accepted her silence. And then, he had turned his attention to fixing something that was broken. She slowly, shakily, picked up her brush and went back to scrubbing the floor. But the rhythm was gone. Her mind was a tumult of confusion and a strange, aching gratitude. He had given her a gift far greater than the one he'd given her on their wedding night. He had given her the gift of not having to speak. He had respected the sanctity of her unspoken pain. He finished with the door and moved on to another task, taking his hunting knife and a whetstone from the mantelpiece. He sat in one of the chairs by the table, the one she had sat in just last night, and began to sharpen the blade, the stone making a soft, whispery, shushing sound as he drew it along the steel. It was a quiet, peaceful, methodical sound, the sound of a man at home in his world, a man whose hands were for building and mending, for working the earth and providing for his home. They were not the hands of a man who hurt women. That evening, the silence at the dinner table was different again. It was no longer the silence of strangers, nor the silence of quiet awareness. It was a silence of shared knowledge, of a truth that had been acknowledged without being spoken. He knew she was wounded, and she knew that he knew, and he had accepted it. When the time came for sleep, he rose from the hearth as he always did. He took his dark wool blanket from the chest. He laid it on the floor. He lay down, his back to her, a silent guardian in the flickering firelight. But tonight, Evelyn understood. His presence on the floor was not just an act of patience or courtesy. It was a promise. It was a quiet, powerful declaration that this space, this home, would be a safe harbor. He was showing her, in the only way he knew how, that he would not be another man to fear. Lying in the darkness, listening to the steady sound of his breathing, Evelyn felt a small, fragile seed of trust begin to take root in the barren soil of her heart. The hard, biting wind of winter eventually tired itself out. It was a slow surrender, a gradual softening. One morning, Evelyn woke to a silence that was different from the usual hush of the plains. It was the thick, damp quiet that comes after a thaw. Outside, the iron-hard ground had softened to dark, rich mud. Patches of snow still lingered in the long shadows of the cabin and the barn, but they were shrinking, weeping into the thirsty earth. A week later, she saw the first hint of green, a faint, hopeful blush on the distant swells of the prairie. Spring was coming, not with a grand announcement, but in a series of quiet, humble whispers. The change in the season brought a change in the rhythm of their lives. Caleb was in the fields from before sunrise until long after sunset, preparing the soil for planting. He was a man in conversation with the land, and it was a language she was slowly beginning to understand. It was spoken in the careful way he tested the soil between his fingers, the straightness of the furrows he plowed, the patient mending of his tools late into the night. His silence was not empty. It was filled with the immense weight of his labor and the quiet hope of a harvest. She had found her own rhythms, too. The cabin was her domain, and she tended to it with a growing confidence. Her hands were no longer soft, but they were capable. She could bake a decent loaf of bread. Her stews were savory, and she knew the precise moment to pull the coffee pot from the fire before it turned bitter. The silence between them remained, but it was no longer a void. It had become a shared space, a familiar quiet that was comfortable in its own way. He still slept on the floor, a silent testament to a promise she had never asked for but had come to rely on. One morning, as she was clearing away their breakfast bowls, he spoke, his voice startling her in the quiet room. "I have to go to town for seed," he said, not looking at her, his attention on lacing up his heavy work boots. "The wagon will be ready in an hour." She simply nodded, assuming he was informing her of his absence for the day. She would be alone, as she often was. She turned back to the basin, ready to start her chores. "Get your shawl," he added, his voice low. She froze, her hands submerged in the warm, soapy water. She turned to look at him, her eyes wide with surprise. He was looking at her now, his expression unreadable as always, but his pale blue eyes held hers for a long moment. He was taking her with him. The journey to the settlement, a place called Prairie Ridge, took half a day. She had not left the farm since the day she arrived months ago, and the experience of moving through the open country again was overwhelming. The world felt immense, the sky a vast, aching blue. She sat on the hard wagon seat beside Caleb, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, watching the landscape unfold. He handled the team of mules with an easy, competent air, the reins held loosely in his hands. He did not speak, but his presence beside her was a solid, reassuring thing. Prairie Ridge was little more than a single dusty street lined with a dozen or so wooden buildings, a general store, a blacksmith, a saloon, and a few small houses. To Evelyn, after months of seeing only the cabin and the barn, it was a bustling metropolis, the noise of a hammer ringing on an anvil. The shouts of men, the whinny of horses, it was a cacophony that both thrilled and terrified her. Caleb pulled the wagon up in front of the general store, a long, low building with a covered porch. He tied the reins and then, to her surprise, he turned to help her down. He placed his large hands on her waist, and for a brief, shocking moment, she was suspended in the air before her feet touched the ground. His touch was impersonal, a simple act of assistance, but it sent a jolt through her. The inside of the store was a wonderland of smells and sights. It smelled of coffee beans, cured leather, tobacco, and salted fish all at once. The shelves were crammed with goods, bolts of fabric, tins of coffee, sacks of flour and sugar, tools, and barrels of pickles. Caleb went about his business with his usual quiet efficiency, negotiating with the storekeeper, a balding man named Henderson, for sacks of seed corn and other supplies. Evelyn stood near the door, feeling out of place, trying to make herself as small as possible. She ran a hand over her own dress, the faded calico she had worn nearly every day for months. It was clean, but worn thin at the elbows. The pattern faded to a pale ghost of its former self. She drifted toward the bolts of fabric, her fingers itching to feel their texture. There was sturdy brown denim, practical gray wool, and cheerful printed cottons. Her eyes were drawn to one particular bolt. It was a simple cotton, the color of a robin's egg, a pale, hopeful blue. It reminded her of the sky on a clear spring morning. She touched it tentatively, the fabric cool and smooth under her calloused fingers. It was the most beautiful thing she had seen in a very long time. "Find something you like," Henderson, the storekeeper, asked from behind the counter, his voice startling her. She snatched her hand back as if burned. "Oh, no, I was just looking," she murmured, her face flushing. Caleb had finished his business. He loaded the heavy sacks onto the wagon while she waited on the porch, her heart still beating a little too fast. When he came back into the store to pay, she saw him glance at the bolt of blue fabric. Then he looked at her worn-out dress. A flicker of something passed through his eyes, but it was gone before she could decipher it. The journey home was as silent as the journey there. The sun was beginning to sink, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. When they arrived back at the cabin, He unloaded the supplies while she went inside to start the fire for their supper. As she was laying the kindling, he came in and set a final brown paper parcel on the table. It was long and slender. She looked at it, then at him, a question in her eyes. He was standing by the door, his hat in his hands, turning the brim over and over. He wouldn't meet her gaze. "I thought," he began, his voice rough, hesitant. He cleared his throat. "I thought you could make yourself a dress." He turned and left the cabin before she could respond, heading to the barn to unhitch the team, leaving her alone with the parcel on the table. Slowly, she approached it. Her hands trembled as she untied the string and unfolded the paper. Inside was the bolt of pale blue fabric. She lifted it, holding it up in the dim light. It was soft, new, and clean. It smelled of the store, of a world beyond the farm. She pressed the fabric to her cheek, and her eyes filled with tears. He had noticed. He had seen her worn-out dress, her longing glance. He had bought this for her. It was the first gift she had ever received that was meant purely for her comfort, for her pleasure. It was not for survival. It was for her. She didn't cry, but a single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. She just stood there, clutching the fabric, until the room was nearly dark. That night, after their silent meal, after he had taken his place on the floor, she did not go to bed. She lit the oil lamp, placed it on the table, and took out her small sewing kit from her satchel. She spread the blue fabric out on the table, its color a pool of light in the dark cabin. Her hands, now clumsy and stiff from farm work, fumbled with the needle and thread, but she worked with a fierce, joyful determination she hadn't felt in years. Stitch by slow, careful stitch, she began to create something new, something beautiful, something that was entirely hers. She worked late into the night, the only sounds the soft hiss of the lamp and the steady breathing of the man sleeping on the floor. It took her 2 weeks to finish the dress. When it was done, she held it up, a wave of pride washing over her. It was simple, with a modest neckline and long sleeves, but it was well made, and the color was as lovely as she had imagined. The next time they went to town, she wore it. As she brushed her hair and fastened the last button, she looked at her reflection in the wavy glass of the window. She saw not the tired, frightened girl who had arrived months ago, but a woman. The blue of the dress brought out the color of her eyes, and the simple, clean lines gave her a dignity she hadn't realized she was missing. When she stepped out of the cabin, Caleb was waiting by the wagon. He stopped what he was doing and looked at her. He didn't smile, but his eyes traveled over her, from the neat collar of the dress down to its hem, and he gave a single, slow nod. It was more than enough. In town, however, the dress made her a target. As she walked beside Caleb down the main street, she felt the weight of curious eyes on her. She heard the whispers, snippets of conversation that snagged in the air. "That's Thorne's mail order, wife." "The dress is new. Wonder where she got that." "Poor thing. Looks like a scared rabbit. Must be a lonely life." Each whisper was a small sting. She felt her face burn with shame. She wanted to run, to hide. She lowered her head, her steps faltering. She felt Caleb's presence beside her, a solid wall of silence. As a group of women standing outside the mercantile fell silent and stared openly at her, he did something he had never done before. He reached out and placed his hand on the small of her back, a light but firm touch that propelled her forward. It was a simple, possessive, protective gesture. It said, without words, "She is with me." The women looked away. After they had finished their business, as they were about to head back to the wagon, Caleb stopped in front of a small stall where a woman was selling baked goods. The air was thick with the sweet smell of cinnamon and honey. He bought a small, golden brown honey cake, wrapped in a piece of wax paper. He turned to Evelyn and held it out to her. She looked from the cake to his face, His expression was as serious as ever, but there was a softness in his eyes she had never seen before. He was offering her a gift, a treat, a balm for the wounds the town's whispers had inflicted. She took it from him, her fingers brushing his. She unwrapped the paper and took a small, hesitant bite. The cake was warm, sweet, and rich with the taste of honey and spices. It was a taste of pure, uncomplicated pleasure. And as the sweetness melted on her tongue, Evelyn smiled. It wasn't the small, hesitant twitch of the lips she sometimes managed. It was a real smile, a genuine, unbidden expression of delight that crinkled the corners of her eyes and lit her entire face from within. It was the first true smile she had given since she was a little girl. Caleb stood perfectly still, watching her. He had never seen her smile before, and in the dusty street of that small, judgmental town, with the taste of honey on her lips, Evelyn felt the last of the winter's ice in her heart finally, truly, begin to melt. The smile born from a taste of honey was a fragile thing, a single spring blossom in a vast and hardened landscape. It was a beginning, but the prairie summer that followed was a trial by fire, determined to scorch any new and tender growth. The sun was no longer a welcome warmth on the horizon. It became a relentless white furnace in a pale, bleached sky. The air did not move. It hung thick and heavy, shimmering in waves above the baked, cracked earth. The wind, when it did stir, brought no relief. Only a blast of heat like the opening of an oven door. With the arrival of this consuming heat, a new and quiet determination had taken root in Evelyn. She was no longer just the cook, the cleaner, the silent occupant of the cabin. She had claimed a small patch of earth for herself behind the cabin, near the well. It was to be a garden. Caleb had turned the soil for her with the plow, his movements strong and efficient, creating a neat rectangle of dark, promising earth. After that, he had left it to her. It was her domain. She worked in it every day, in the cool hours of the early morning and the fading light of evening. But the midday sun was unavoidable. She carried buckets of water from the well until her arms ached, her back burned, and the muscles in her shoulders screamed in protest. She coaxed stubborn green shoots from the soil beans, squash, and precious tomato plants. The garden became her purpose, a place where her own labor could bring forth life. It was a fight against the unforgiving sun and the thirsty ground, and she poured all of her unspoken energy into it. It was a way of putting down roots, of proving to herself, and perhaps to the silent man who watched her from the fields, that she was more than just a bargain struck in desperation. She could create, she could nurture, she could make something grow. Caleb never said a word about her garden, but sometimes, when he came back from the fields, she would see his gaze drift to the patch of green, a long, assessing look. One evening, she found a series of rough stakes he had sharpened lying by the garden plot, perfect for supporting the tomato vines. He had made them for her, leaving them as a silent offering, an unspoken acknowledgement of her toil. The work was relentless, and she was not as strong as she pretended to be. She was fueled by a stubborn pride, a deep-seated need to prove her worth. She ignored the dull ache in her back, the trembling in her arms as she lifted yet another bucket of water. She pushed herself harder and harder, as if her own survival depended on the survival of those fragile green plants. One afternoon, the heat was at its zenith. There were no clouds, no breeze, only the oppressive weight of the sun beating down. She should have been inside, in the relative cool of the cabin. But a row of weeds had sprung up, threatening her young squash plants. She told herself she would only work for an hour. She knelt in the dirt, her sunbonnet offering little protection. The heat radiated up from the ground, seeming to cook her from below as the sun beat down from above. Sweat trickled down her temples, stinging her eyes. Her new blue dress, now her work dress, was dark with perspiration and clung to her skin. After a time, the world began to feel unreal. The steady hum of insects grew loud and then faded. A strange dizziness washed over her, and the edges of her vision began to blur and darken. She knew she should stop. She knew she needed water, shade, but there was just one more weed, and then another. She reached for it, and the world tilted violently. The blue of the sky and the brown of the earth swirled together into a meaningless blur. She felt a strange, floating sensation, a sense of detachment from her own body. A wave of nausea rose in her throat. She tried to push herself up, to stand, but her limbs felt like they were made of lead. The last thing she remembered was the hot, gritty taste of dust as the ground rose up to meet her. She was adrift in a sea of darkness, but she was not alone. She was aware, in a distant, fragmented way, of being lifted. Strong arms slid under her back and beneath her knees, raising her from the scorching earth as if she weighed nothing. There was a moment of confusion, a dreamlike sensation of floating, and then the world shifted from blinding, painful light to a cool, welcome darkness. She heard a low, rough voice murmur something, but the words were indistinct, lost in the roaring in her ears. When she woke, the first thing she was aware of was the coolness. A damp, cool cloth was resting on her forehead, a small miracle of relief. The brutal sunlight that had pierced her eyelids was gone, replaced by the soft, dim light of the cabin's interior. She was lying on the bed, her bed. She turned her head, her movements slow and languid, and saw that her dusty boots had been removed and placed neatly on the floor. A soft, scraping sound drew her attention to the hearth. Caleb was there, his back to her. He was standing over the fire, stirring something in a small pot. His broad shoulders were slumped with a weariness she had never seen in him before. He looked out of place, a giant confined to the small, domestic space of the hearth. He moved with a clumsy uncertainty, the spoon awkward in his large hand. She tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness washed over her, and she fell back against the pillow with a soft groan. The sound made him turn. He saw that she was awake, and he walked over to the bed, wiping his hands on his trousers. His face was etched with lines of concern, his expression more open and unguarded than she had ever seen it. "Lie still," he said, his voice a low command. "What happened?" she whispered, her own voice sounding thin and reedy. "The sun," he said, his tone clipped. "You've been out for a spell." He gestured vaguely toward the pot on the fire. "I made some porridge." He disappeared from her view and returned a moment later with a steaming bowl. It was simple oat porridge, thin and a little lumpy, but the smell was wholesome. He pulled one of the straight-backed chairs to the bedside and sat, holding the bowl. "I can—" she started, trying to push herself up again. "No," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Just eat." He wasn't asking. She was too weak to protest. She let him help her, his arm surprisingly gentle as he supported her shoulders, helping her to sit up against the headboard. He held the bowl for her, and she took the spoon with a trembling hand, lifting a small amount to her lips. It was warm and nourishing. They remained like that for some time, in a silence that was unlike any they had shared before. It was not the silence of strangers or the silence of unspoken truths. It was the quiet, intimate silence of the sick room, a space where the normal rules of their life together were suspended. She, who had taken such pride in her role as the keeper of his home, was now utterly dependent on his care, and he, the stoic, self-sufficient farmer, was now a fumbling, uncertain nursemaid. When she had eaten as much as she could, he took the bowl and set it aside. He dipped the cloth in a basin of cool water, wrung it out, and placed it back on her forehead. "You have to eat," he said, his voice gruff, as if he were angry. But she heard the current of concern running beneath the harshness. "And you need to rest. Don't try to do so much. The garden can wait." She just looked at him, too exhausted to speak. He stood and looked down at her for a long moment, a strange, conflicted expression on his face. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the cabin, leaving her alone in the deepening twilight. She slept again, a deep, healing sleep. When she woke later, the cabin was dark. Save for the soft orange glow of the embers in the hearth, she felt stronger, the dizziness gone. She sat up, swinging her legs over the side of the bed. The house was quiet. She assumed he was asleep on the floor, as always. But when her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she saw that his blanket was still folded on the chest. He wasn't inside. A sudden, inexplicable worry seized her. She stood, her bare feet silent on the floorboards, and walked to the open cabin door. And there he was. He was sitting on the top step of the small porch, his elbows resting on his knees, his head in his hands. He was just a silhouette against the vast, star-dusted canvas of the night sky. He was not mending, not cleaning, not working. He was utterly still, staring out into the immense, dark emptiness of the prairie. She stood in the doorway, hidden in the shadows, and watched him. He was not at peace. She could see it in the rigid set of his shoulders, in the way he sat as if bearing a great and terrible weight. He looked profoundly lonely, and a deep, aching sadness emanated from him, a palpable thing that reached her across the small space. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that he was not thinking of the farm, or the harvest, or the weather. He was thinking of her. She was the reason for his vigil, the cause of the sorrow that seemed to pour from him. Her presence in his life, she realized, had changed everything. She had breached the walls of his solitude, a solitude he had perhaps carefully constructed as a defense against the world. He was a man who knew how to care for the land, for his animals, for himself, but he did not know how to care for a woman. Her collapse in the garden had shown him her fragility, and it had frightened him. He was wrestling with a new and terrifying responsibility, a new and unwelcome emotion. He was wrestling with the fact that he cared what happened to her. Watching him there, a lone, tormented figure against the vast indifference of the night, Evelyn felt a wave of compassion so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. Her heart, which had been so carefully guarded, so afraid of being bruised, ached for him. He was not a hard, unfeeling man. He was a man carrying a silent burden, a man whose quiet heart was capable of a sorrow she was only just beginning to comprehend, and in that moment, she knew that she was no longer just his bartered bride. She was a part of his life, a part of his struggle, and for the first time, she did not wish to be anywhere else. Her collapse in the garden created a fissure in the bedrock of their routine, and through that crack, something new and uncertain began to grow. Caleb's vigilance was a quiet, constant thing. He took to filling the water buckets himself each morning, leaving them on the porch for her so she wouldn't have to work the heavy pump. If he saw her in the garden during the hottest part of the day, he would walk over, his shadow falling over her, and say with a gruffness that barely masked his concern, "That's enough. Go inside." It was not a suggestion. She would obey, retreating to the cool of the cabin with a strange mix of resentment at being treated like a fragile doll and a deep, secret gratitude for his care. The summer wore on, the heat finally breaking in a series of dramatic thunderstorms that swept across the plains, leaving the air clean and the earth smelling of rain and new life. The crops in the field grew tall, and Evelyn's small garden flourished under her patient hand. She and Caleb had settled into a new kind of silence, one that was less about the space between them and more about the shared life they were building, brick by quiet brick. One late afternoon, the sky to the west began to bruise with the dark, ominous purple of an approaching storm. The air grew heavy and still, holding its breath before the coming onslaught. Caleb had ridden out early that morning to the far end of his property to mend a stretch of fence that had been damaged by wandering cattle. He would be racing the storm to get home. Evelyn was securing the cabin, latching the shutters. When she heard it, it was a low, distressed sound from the barn, a sound of pain that cut through the pre-storm quiet. She hurried outside, her skirts whipping around her ankles in the rising wind. Inside the barn, the air was thick with the warm, sweet smell of hay and animals. In the far stall, their only milk cow, a young Jersey heifer named Daisy, was in distress. She was lying in the straw, her sides heaving, her eyes wide with pain and fear. Evelyn knew the cow was due to calf soon, but she had assumed it was still weeks away. It was clear the time was now, and it was also clear that something was terribly wrong. The labor had started, but it was not progressing. A cold knot of fear tightened in Evelyn's stomach. She knew nothing about birthing animals. It was a man's work, a world of grunts and blood and mysterious, practical knowledge. She was terrified. Her first instinct was to do nothing, to wait for Caleb. He would know what to do. But a glance at the darkening sky told her he could be hours away, and a look at the suffering animal told her that hours might be too long. She thought of her father, of the grim winter when they had lost 2 lambs during a difficult birth because he hadn't known how to help. She remembered the hunger that followed, the hollow feeling in her belly that had lasted for months. This cow and the calf it carried were not just animals. They were their future. They were milk, butter, and eventually, money. They were the difference between a hard winter and a starving one. She couldn't just wait. Taking a deep, shaky breath, she approached the stall. "Easy, girl," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Easy now." The cow shifted its head to look at her, a low moan rumbling in its chest. Evelyn forced herself to remember snippets of conversation she had overheard between farmers, things she had never paid much attention to before. She fetched a bucket of clean water and a rag. She washed her hands and arms, scrubbing them raw. Then, her heart hammering against her ribs, she entered the stall. What followed was a battle. It was a primal, desperate struggle against nature. There was no dignity in it, only sweat, fear, and a fierce, stubborn will to see life win. She spoke to the cow constantly, her voice a low, soothing murmur, a stream of nonsense words meant to calm both the animal and herself. Her fear was a living thing, a cold presence at her side, but the cow's pain was greater, and Evelyn pushed her own terror aside. She had to help. She had to reach inside, to find the source of the problem. Her hands, shaking violently at first, learned a new and terrible intimacy. She discovered the calf was breech, its legs tangled, unable to be born. She had to try and turn it. It was a grueling, seemingly impossible task. The muscles in her arms and back strained, burning with an effort she didn't know she possessed. She was covered in grime and sweat, her hair falling from its pins, her dress ruined. But in the heat of the struggle, she forgot everything. She forgot her fear. She forgot her own weakness. She forgot the silent man she had married. There was only this stall, this suffering animal, and the fragile, stubborn life she was trying to save. She had no idea how long she had been fighting when she heard the barn door slide open. A rectangle of gray. Stormy light fell across the floor. Caleb stood there, silhouetted against the coming storm, rain already beginning to slick his hat and coat. He had obviously ridden hard to beat the weather. He took in the scene in an instant, the distressed cow, the buckets, and Evelyn, on her knees in the straw, her arm buried to the shoulder, her face pale and streaked with dirt, set in a mask of fierce concentration. He didn't move. He didn't rush in to take over. He simply stood in the doorway, the wind and rain beginning to howl behind him, and he watched her. Evelyn barely registered his presence. "It's stuck," she grunted, her teeth clenched with effort. I can't turn it." He still didn't move, his eyes fixed on her, and in his gaze, she saw something she had never seen before. It wasn't pity, it wasn't concern. It was a look of profound, staggering respect. He was seeing her not as the fragile girl he had rescued from the sun, not as the quiet housekeeper who cooked his meals, but as a partner in this harsh, demanding life. He was seeing a strength in her that she had never known she possessed, and in the depths of his cool blue eyes, For the first time, she saw a flicker of unmistakable, undeniable pride. That look, that silent acknowledgement, was like a shot of whiskey to her soul. It gave her a fresh surge of strength. With a final, desperate cry of effort, she gave one last heave. There was a sudden, sickening give, and then a great, wet rush. A small, slick, impossibly long-legged creature slid out into the straw. It was over. The calf lay still for a terrifying moment, and then it gave a small shake of its head and let out a weak, bleating cry. The mother, exhausted but alive, immediately began to lick her newborn, her rough tongue working to clean and stimulate it. Evelyn slumped back against the wall of the stall, her body trembling with exhaustion and relief. She was a wreck, covered in filth, her muscles screaming. She looked at the new life in the straw, this small miracle she had helped bring into the world, and felt a wave of satisfaction so pure it brought tears to her eyes. Only then did she become fully aware of Caleb. He walked slowly toward the stall, his spurs making a soft jingling sound. He knelt, running a practiced hand over the calf, checking its limbs. He then looked at the mother, his expression softening as he watched her tend to her baby. Finally, he looked at Evelyn. She braced herself for a scolding, for his anger at her interference in his world. He reached out a hand, not to her, but to help her up. She took it, and his grip was strong and steady. Pulling her to her feet, she felt unsteady, her legs weak. "You did good," he said, his voice low and rough. And then he said the word that changed everything. Evelyn. It was the first time he had ever spoken her name. It sounded strange and wonderful in the quiet of the barn. It was not the name of a possession or a duty. It was her name, spoken by him. It sounded like a validation, a claiming, but not of ownership. It was an acknowledgement of her as a person, as his equal. In the days that followed, the change was palpable. He started calling her Evelyn all the time. "Evelyn, the coffee is good this morning." "Evelyn, did you see the hawk over the south field?" Each time he said it, it sent a small, secret thrill through her. In response, she found herself opening up in small, quiet ways. She learned that he preferred his bacon crisp and his coffee black. She started making it for him just so, a small, daily act of care. When she did the laundry, she took extra time folding his work shirts, smoothing the worn fabric with her hands, a gesture of tenderness that felt both bold and necessary. Their life was still quiet, their conversations still sparse, but the silence was now filled with a new, warm understanding. They were no longer just two strangers living under the same roof. They were a man and a woman building a life together, speaking a language of small, kind acts. And yet, a part of her held back. A small, cold knot of fear remained in the deepest corner of her heart. The kindness he showed her felt like a beautiful, fragile dream, and she was terrified of waking up. The echoes of her past were still too loud, the harsh words, the rough hands, the constant feeling of being a burden, of being worthless. She had been sold once, a commodity to settle a debt. How could she ever truly believe that she was worthy of this quiet man's pride? This gentle man's care to be respected was one thing, but to be cherished, to be loved, that felt like a truth that belonged to other women, in other lives. And so, even as she handed him his plate with the perfectly crisped bacon, even as she felt a genuine warmth spread through her chest when he said her name, she kept a small, essential part of herself locked away, convinced that it was only a matter of time before he, too, realized his purchase had been a poor one. The seasons turned, and the fierce, sun-bleached days of summer gave way to the golden melancholy of autumn. The harvest was good. The corn stood tall and heavy in the fields, and the small garden behind the cabin had yielded a bounty that filled their root cellar. Life settled into a new rhythm, a quiet harmony of shared labor. The space between Evelyn and Caleb was no longer an empty void, but a comfortable silence, filled with the unspoken language of partnership. He had continued to call her by her name, and the sound of it on his lips had become a small, daily assurance, a quiet claiming that never failed to warm her. In turn, she had learned the landscape of his habits, the contours of his quiet life. She knew he liked to watch the sunrise from the porch with a cup of coffee before heading to the fields. She knew the precise way he liked his shirts folded. She knew the sound of his footsteps, steady and sure, as he returned to the cabin at the end of the day. These small intimacies were the threads from which she was weaving a new life, a life that held a fragile, tentative kind of peace. But the fear, the deep, ingrained belief in her own worthlessness, was a stubborn weed. It had been planted long ago, in a place of harsh words and cold shoulders, and its roots ran deep. Caleb's kindness was like gentle rain on parched ground, but she could not yet bring herself to believe that anything beautiful could truly grow there. She saw his every gentle act, his every quiet provision, through a distorted lens. It was not affection, she told herself, but duty. It was not desire, but decency. He was a good man saddled with a bad bargain, and he was simply making the best of it. This conviction was her shield, protecting her from a hope that felt far more dangerous than despair. With the harvest gathered, it was time for another trip to Prairie Ridge. They needed to sell their surplus corn and stock up on supplies for the coming winter flour, salt, sugar, and oil for the lamps. The journey felt different this time. She sat beside him on the wagon seat not as a terrified bride, but as a partner. She wore her blue dress, which was now soft from washing, and a shawl she had knitted during the long summer evenings. The town was the same dusty, noisy, and filled with watchful eyes, but Evelyn held her head a little higher. She had faced down the sun and the soil and won. She had helped to bring a new life into the world in the storm-tossed barn. She was no longer the frightened girl who had arrived in a dusty carriage. While Caleb was negotiating a price for his corn with a grain merchant, she went to Henderson's general store with a small list of her own. The store was warm and crowded, a hub of activity and conversation. As she waited for Mr. Henderson to weigh out a bag of flour, she became aware of two women standing near the pickle barrel behind her. She recognized one of them as the storekeeper's wife, a woman with a perpetually pursed mouth and sharp, inquisitive eyes. "That's her, Mrs." Henderson said, her voice a low, conspiratorial hiss that was perfectly audible in the crowded room. "Thorne's wife. She looks a bit healthier than the last time." The other woman, a stout figure in a dark bonnet, replied, "Still has the look of a startled deer, though." "Can you blame her, Mrs.?" Henderson sniffed. "Married off to that silent giant. He barely speaks a word. My Henry says he comes in, gets what he needs, and leaves. Never a bit of gossip, never a friendly word." "I heard," the other woman leaned closer, her voice dropping further, "that it's not a real marriage at all. You know?" Evelyn felt a cold dread begin to creep up her spine. She kept her back to them, pretending to inspect a display of canned peaches, but her ears were straining, against her will, to hear more. "What do you mean, not real?" "My cousin's boy, Jeb, delivered a plowshare out to their farm last month." "Mrs.," Henderson whispered, the words dripping with salacious satisfaction. "He had to stay the night because his wagon broke an axle. He swore on a Bible, Martha, that when he woke in the morning, Caleb Thorne was asleep on the floor by the fire, on a blanket, and she was alone in the bed." "No," Martha gasped, a sound of feigned shock. "It's true. The man is living like a monk in his own house, bought himself a wife and is using her as a hired girl. She cooks, she cleans, and that's the end of it. He's either a saint or a fool. I can't decide which." "Perhaps he's just decent," Martha offered, though there was no charity in her tone. "And she's not, up to the task. She's a frail-looking thing." "Frail or not, a wife has duties." "Mrs." Henderson declared with grim finality, He's wasting his money and his name on her. He deserves a proper wife, one who can give him sons and warm his bed, not a scared little mouse who sleeps alone. The words struck Evelyn like a physical blow. Each syllable was a stone, and she felt the weight of them crushing the fragile peace she had so carefully constructed. She felt the eyes of everyone in the store on her, felt their pity, their scorn. She was a fraud, a hired girl with a wedding ring, a loveless bride. The whispers confirmed her deepest, darkest fears. Caleb's kindness wasn't care, it was pity. His respect for her space wasn't a gift, it was a rejection. He slept on the floor not to protect her, but because he couldn't bear to be near her. She paid for her flower with trembling hands, not meeting Mr. Henderson's curious gaze, and fled the store. The journey home was an exercise in silent misery. She sat beside Caleb, a rigid statue of despair, the cruel words echoing in her mind. He glanced at her a few times, a question in his eyes, but she could not look at him. How could she face him, knowing what a burden she was? He was a good man, a decent man, and she was a millstone around his neck, dragging him down, making him a subject of pity and ridicule in the town. That night, she couldn't eat. She pushed the food around her plate, her throat tight with unshed tears. After the meal, he went about his usual routine, but she watched him with new, agonized eyes. His every quiet gesture seemed to confirm the town's verdict. He was a saint, and she was his cross to bear. She knew what she had to do. She was a bargain he was honor-bound to keep, but she could release him from it. She could give him back his life, his home, his good name. After he had settled onto his blanket on the floor and his breathing had deepened into the slow, steady rhythm of sleep, she rose from the bed. By the dying light of the embers, she sat at the table with a piece of paper and a stub of charcoal. Her hands shook so badly she could barely form the letters. "Mr. Thorne," she wrote, her formality a painful reminder of the distance she now felt between them. "I am grateful for the kindness you have shown me. You are a good man, and you deserve more than the bargain you were given. You deserve a proper wife. I heard the women in town. They are right. I am releasing you. Please do not look for me. Evelyn." She folded the paper and left it in the center of the table where he would see it in the morning. Then, moving like a ghost, she gathered her few belongings, her old dress, her sewing kit, and stuffed them into the canvas satchel she had arrived with. It felt like a lifetime ago. She slipped out of the cabin, the night air cold on her hot cheeks. The moon was a bright, cold disk in the sky, illuminating the farm in a stark, silvery light. She made her way to the barn, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. This was the right thing to do, the only thing to do. It was an act of kindness, she told herself, the only one she could offer him in return for his. Inside the barn, the air was warm and smelled of hay and animals. She chose a gentle-looking mare, murmuring soft, apologetic words as she led it from its stall. Her hands were clumsy in the darkness as she fumbled with the heavy saddle, her tears blurring her vision. "What are you doing, Evelyn?" His voice came from the darkness of the barn doorway. It was not loud, not angry, just a low, quiet question that made her freeze, her hand still on the saddle buckle. He stepped into the barn, a tall, imposing shadow against the moonlit yard. He wasn't holding a lantern or a rifle. He just stood there, watching her. She turned to face him, the tears she had been holding back finally spilling over, tracking clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. "I have to go," she whispered, her voice choked with sobs. I can't be this for you." "Be what?" he asked, his voice still unnervingly calm. "A servant," she cried, the ugly word tearing from her throat. "A hired girl. I heard them in town. Caleb, I heard what they say, that you sleep on the floor, that I'm not a real wife, that you're a fool for keeping me. And they're right, you need someone who isn't broken. You need a wife who isn't afraid. I'm setting you free." She expected him to argue, to deny it, to be angry. but he just stood there, letting her words, her pain, her shame, pour into the quiet space between them. He let her empty herself of all the poison she had swallowed that day. When she was finished, her sobs subsiding into ragged, hiccuping breaths, he took a slow step toward her, and another. He stopped just a few feet away. The moonlight streamed through the open door, illuminating half of his face, leaving the other in shadow. His expression was serious, his eyes dark pools of intensity. He did not reach for her. He did not raise his voice. He simply looked at her, his gaze holding hers, and he spoke the truest words he had ever spoken. "This was just a house before you came," he said, his voice low and steady, each word carefully chosen, each one landing with the weight of absolute truth. He took a breath. "If you leave, it won't be a home anymore." His words fell into the cavernous silence of the barn, and for a moment, they seemed to be the only real things in the world. "If you leave, it won't be a home anymore." The wind outside seemed to die down. The rustle of hay ceased. Even the gentle shifting of the animals in their stalls went quiet, as if all of creation were holding its breath, waiting for her response. Evelyn stood frozen, the half-fastened saddle buckle cold beneath her trembling fingers. The tears on her face began to cool in the night air. The sentence echoed in her mind, turning over and over, dismantling the careful, painful logic she had constructed. She had built her entire flight on the premise that she was a burden, an object that was diminishing his life. But his words suggested the opposite. They suggested she was not a subtraction, but an essential part of the equation. It was a thought so foreign, so utterly contrary to everything she believed about herself, that her mind could not immediately grasp it. He took a step out of the shadows of the doorway and into the shaft of moonlight that cut across the barn floor. It illuminated him, not as the silent, intimidating figure she had first met, but as a man stripped of all pretense. The moonlight softened the hard lines of his face, revealing a weariness in his eyes, a vulnerability around his mouth that she had never seen before. He was not angry. He looked bereft, as if he were the one being abandoned. Slowly, as if approaching a frightened animal, he closed the distance between them. Each step was deliberate, measured. He stopped when he was close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, close enough that she could see the pulse beating in his throat. She could smell the clean, cold scent of the night air on his clothes, mixed with the familiar, smoky scent of the cabin's hearth. She braced herself, expecting him to take the reins, to scold her, to demand she return to the house. Instead, he did something that shattered the last of her composure. He lifted his hand, not quickly, but with a slow, aching hesitation. It was a farmer's hand, large and calloused, crisscrossed with the scars of hard labor. But as it reached for hers, it seemed imbued with a terrifying gentleness, and it was trembling. Just slightly, almost imperceptibly, but in the stillness of the barn, it was as obvious as a shout. His fingers, rough and warm, closed around her own. Her hand was small and cold in his grasp, lost in the strength of his palm. His touch was not possessive. It was a question, an anchor, a plea. "Evelyn," he said, his voice a low, rough thing, full of an emotion she couldn't name. He swallowed, as if the words were hard to form. "I know how you came here. I know it was a bargain, a debt. It wasn't right. It was a business deal. And you were the goods." He acknowledged the ugly truth of their beginning, speaking the words she had never dared to think so plainly. He did not try to soften it, to pretend it was something it wasn't. The honesty of it was a fresh pain, but a clean one. "I didn't know what to do," he went on, his gaze fixed on their joined hands. I don't know about women. I only know this land, this work. I saw how scared you were that first night, and every day after. I didn't want to be another reason for you to be afraid." He finally lifted his eyes to hers. and the raw sincerity in them stole her breath. So I stayed on the floor. I thought I was giving you peace. I didn't know the town would twist it into something ugly, something to shame you with. The tears began to fall again. Silent, hot drops that dripped from her chin onto their hands. They were not tears of sorrow or fear, but of a profound, earth-shattering confusion. I know I don't have much, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. His thumb moved over her knuckles in a slow, uncertain caress. This land is hard, and some years it gives more than it takes, and some years it's the other way around. This house is small. I am a quiet man. I don't have pretty words, but if you want to, Evelyn, I'm asking you to stay. He paused, and the weight of his next words settled over her like a physical thing. Not as the woman who was sold to me, not as part of a bargain. I want you to stay as a woman who is chosen. I am choosing you, right here, right now, if you'll have me. It was a proposal, not of marriage that had already been brutally transacted, but of something far more important. A proposal of the heart. It was a request for a new beginning, a chance to burn the old contract and write a new one, together. The sheer, impossible grace of it was too much to bear. It was a gift she had never dreamed of, and she felt a desperate, panicked certainty that she was unworthy of it. She pulled her hand from his, the sudden loss of contact leaving her feeling cold and exposed. She wrapped her arms around her waist, a defensive posture she had learned long ago. "You don't understand," she whispered, shaking her head, the words choked and broken. "You're a good man, Caleb. You are. Everything good. But you can't choose me." "Why not?" he asked, his voice gentle, patient. "Because I'm not whole." The words tore from her, a confession she had held in the dark for years. "There are pieces of me that are missing, that were broken off and thrown away a long time ago. I am not whole, Caleb, not in my body, and not in my spirit. My trust in things, in people, it's gone. I don't know how to get it back." She finally looked at him, her eyes pleading for him to understand, to see the ugly truth of her and retract his impossible offer. "You deserve a whole person, a woman who can meet you with a full heart, not the shattered remains of one." He listened to her confession without flinching. He did not look away, did not show a flicker of pity or disgust. He simply took her words, her pain, and held them in the quiet space between them. When she was finished, a great, shuddering silence fell, broken only by her ragged breathing. He took a step closer, closing the space she had created between them. He reached out again, not for her hand, but to gently cup her face, his thumb stroking away the tears on her cheeks. His touch was reverence. "I never wanted someone perfect," he said, his voice low and firm, imbued with a certainty that seemed to shake the very foundations of the barn. "I've seen perfect things, polished wood that splinters, shiny tools that break under pressure. The world is too hard for perfect things. Evelyn, they don't last." He looked deep into her eyes, and she felt as if he were seeing past the fear, past the scars, and into the very core of her soul. "I don't want a whole heart. I want your heart. I don't want a perfect woman." His voice cracked with emotion, with a truth so powerful it was almost a prayer. "I just want you." The three simple words landed, not in her mind, but in that broken, empty place inside her. They were not a denial of her wounds, but an acceptance of them. He was not trying to fix her. He was choosing her, broken pieces and all. He wanted her. A sob, raw and wrenching, escaped her lips, a sound of grief and hope and terror all at once. And then she fell forward, her head resting against his chest, her hands clutching the rough fabric of his shirt. His arms came around her, holding her tightly, securely. He was so solid, so real. He smelled of earth and wood smoke and honesty. She wept into his shirt, emptying herself of years of unspoken pain. of the lonely, aching conviction that she was unlovable. And he just held her, one hand stroking her hair, the other pressed firmly against her back, anchoring her to this new, unbelievable reality. They stood like that for a long time, in the quiet, moonlit barn, while the storm of her grief finally passed. When her sobs subsided, he gently eased her back. Though he did not release her, he kept his hands on her arms, his gaze soft. Without a word, he turned and began to unbuckle the saddle she had so desperately tried to fasten. He lifted it from the mare's back and set it on its stand. He gave the horse a gentle pat on the neck before turning back to her. He took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers, and led her out of the barn. The world outside was quiet. The moon was high and bright, and the stars were scattered like diamond dust across a velvet sky. They walked back to the cabin, their footsteps the only sound. It was the first time they had ever walked hand in hand. It felt strange and fragile, and more right than anything she had ever known. When they entered the cabin, the first thing she saw was the folded piece of paper on the table. Her letter, her goodbye. Caleb released her hand and walked to the table. He picked up the paper, but he did not read it. He looked at it for a long moment, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the embers. Then he turned and tossed it into the hearth. It landed on the glowing coals, and a single, bright flame shot up, consuming the paper in an instant. It turned black, curled at the edges, and then dissolved into ash. He had burned the contract. The old life, the old bargain, was over. He turned to face her. He looked at her, then at the bed, then at the folded blanket on the chest. The question hung in the air, unspoken but monumental. The choice, for the first time, was hers. All hers. That night, the house held its breath. The fire in the hearth burned low, casting long, dancing shadows that were no longer menacing, but soft and protective. For the first time since her arrival, the dark wool blanket remained folded on the chest, a relic of a life that had ended only hours before in the moonlit barn, after Caleb had burned her farewell letter, turning her desperate goodbye into a whisper of ash. He had looked at her, then at the bed. The question in his eyes was a gentle, terrifying thing, offering a world she had never dared to imagine. In response, she had simply walked to the bed, turned down the quilt, and gotten in. It was the boldest, most frightening act of her life. A moment later, she felt the mattress dip as he lay down beside her, his weight a solid, grounding presence in the darkness. He did not touch her. He lay on his back, a respectful distance between them, and she lay on her side, facing the wall, her body as rigid as a board. But his warmth reached across the small space, a silent promise, and for the first time, she slept in a man's bed not as a duty, but as a choice. The month that followed was a quiet, tender exploration of a new and fragile territory. They were like two people learning a language without words. The cabin, which had once felt like a vast, lonely space, now seemed to have shrunk, filled with the quiet awareness of each other. Their days were still governed by the rhythms of the farm, but their evenings were different. He would read from a worn copy of an almanac by the firelight, his low voice a comforting rumble in the quiet. She would take up her knitting, the soft click of the needles a gentle counterpoint to his reading. There were small, hesitant gestures of care. He began to leave a wildflower, a stubborn bit of purple aster, or a hardy prairie sunflower on her plate at breakfast. She, in turn, began to mend the small tears in his work shirts with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible, an act of quiet devotion. But the ghost of the past was not so easily banished. A part of her was still waiting for the other shoe to drop, for this beautiful, impossible dream to shatter. Though she shared his bed, she still flinched if he moved too suddenly in the night, a reflexive, ingrained fear she could not control. He never commented on it. He simply learned to move more slowly, more deliberately around her, giving her the space and the time she needed to believe she was safe. One evening, as the first chill of true autumn was settling over the land. He put down his almanac and looked at her, his expression serious. "Evelyn," he said, and the sound of her name, now so familiar, still made her heart skip a beat. "I think we should have a wedding." She looked up from her knitting, her hands stilling, her eyes wide with confusion. "But we are married." "No," he said, shaking his head. "We have a piece of paper, a legal document that says you belong to me. That's not a marriage. That's a bill of sale." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his gaze intense. "I want to have a real wedding, with a preacher, with vows. I want to stand up before God and any neighbor who cares to watch. And I want to choose you. And I want you to have the chance to choose me, freely, with no debts and no bargains between us." Tears sprang to her eyes, hot and immediate. He was offering to rewrite their beginning, to give her the one thing she had never had a choice. Made in the light of day, witnessed and honored. "Yes," she whispered, the word a soft, shaky breath. "Yes, Caleb." They held it a month later, on a crisp, clear day when the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue and the prairie grasses had turned to a sea of pale gold. It was not a grand affair. There was no feast, no music, no crowd of well-wishers. They had invited only their closest neighbors, an elderly couple named Silas and Martha Miller, who had a farm a few miles to the east. The preacher was a traveling Methodist minister, a thin, kind-faced man named Reverend Brown, whom Caleb had ridden out to meet on the trail. Evelyn wore her blue dress. It was the only fine thing she owned, and it felt right. It was the dress of her new life, a symbol of the first time he had truly seen her, as she fastened the buttons that morning. Her hands shook so badly she could barely manage the task. She was not afraid in the same way she had been on the day she arrived. The old, cold dread was gone, but in its place was a new and terrifying vulnerability. To accept this new beginning meant opening her heart completely, and she was terrified that it was still too broken to be of any use to anyone. She had spent the previous evenings creating their wedding rings. There was no money for gold, but she had something far more precious. She took a fine, strong thread of linen and divided it into 2 bundles. She dyed one bundle with the juice of wild berries until it was a deep, earthy brown, the color of the soil Caleb worked. She dyed the other with the petals of a faded blue flower until it was the same pale, hopeful color as her dress. Then she sat by the firelight, her fingers moving deftly, and she braided the 2 colors together into 2 simple, sturdy cords, brown and blue, the earth and the sky, him and her. The ceremony was held just outside the cabin door, under the vast, open sky. The Millers stood as witnesses, their faces weathered and kind. The Reverend Brown's voice was a gentle drone against the soft whisper of the wind. Evelyn stood beside Caleb, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She could feel the warmth of his body next to hers, a solid, reassuring presence. When it came time for the vows, the preacher's words seemed to fade into the background. All she could hear was the frantic beating of her own heart. When it was her turn to speak, her voice was a trembling whisper, but when she looked at Caleb, the world came into focus. He was not looking at the preacher, he was looking at her, and in his eyes, she saw the answer to every fear she had ever held. She saw not the reflection of a broken, bartered girl, but the image of a strong, capable woman. She saw the woman who had coaxed a garden from the hard-packed earth, the woman who had saved a calf in a storm, the woman who had turned his silent house into a home. In his gaze, there was no pity. There was only a profound, unwavering respect, a deep and abiding pride, and a love so steady and so powerful it felt as real and as solid as the ground beneath her feet. He saw her not as she had been, but as she was, and as she could be. He saw her whole, and in that moment, seeing herself reflected in his eyes, she finally, truly believed it. When it came time for the rings, She took one of the braided cords and, with fingers that had miraculously stopped shaking, tied it around his thick, strong finger. He then took the other and tied it around hers, his touch infinitely gentle. There was no gold, no diamond, only a simple, hand-braided cord of brown and blue. It was more precious than any jewel. The Reverend Brown pronounced them man and wife, and Silas Miller let out a hearty, "Amen, Martha." Her eyes shining, gave Evelyn a warm, motherly hug. And Caleb, her husband, her choice, simply looked at her and smiled. It was a small, quiet smile that transformed his serious face, lighting it from within. It was the most beautiful smile she had ever seen. Life after their second wedding did not change in dramatic ways, but the foundations of it had shifted, settled, and become solid. The quiet between them was now a comfortable, shared peace. Their conversations were still simple, about the weather, the crops, the price of corn, but beneath the plain words, a new language flowed, a language of shared glances, of small, knowing smiles, of hands that brushed as they worked side by side. The house was no longer just a house. It was a sanctuary. It was home. One evening, as dusk was settling over the plains, painting the sky in soft shades of lavender and rose, Evelyn was in the kitchen, lighting the oil lamp. The day had been long, spent preserving the last of the garden's bounty, and she was tired. But it was a good, satisfying kind of tired. She trimmed the wick and adjusted the flame, and a warm, golden glow spread through the room, pushing back the evening shadows. The light caught the braided cord on her finger, and she smiled a small, secret smile. She heard the cabin door open and close, heard the familiar, heavy tread of his boots on the floorboards. She didn't turn. She continued to adjust the lamp, her movements calm and unhurried. She felt his presence behind her, a familiar warmth. Then, she felt a hand rest on the small of her back. The touch was impossibly light, as gentle as the evening breeze that was beginning to stir outside. It was a simple, quiet gesture of presence, of affection, of belonging. A year ago, such a sudden, unexpected touch would have sent a jolt of pure terror through her. She would have flinched, her heart seizing, her body bracing for a blow. But tonight, she did not flinch. She did not startle. A deep, profound peace settled over her, a quiet warmth that spread from his hand through her entire body. She simply leaned into his touch, a small, almost imperceptible movement, and continued to adjust the lamp, her hand steady, her heart calm. The shadows danced on the walls. The golden light filled their small home, and for the first time in a life that had been filled with fear, Evelyn was not afraid. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to our channel. Wild West Stories 1850, give this video a like, and press the hype button to help this story reach more listeners just like you.